So, this is our last class meeting before the break. So, I'm actually really glad so many of you showed up. I was expecting a smaller group.
I've been so busy, I don't forgot it's the last class before break.
Well, good. Keep that up. Just keep showing up all next week, you know. Start wondering why no one else is here. Just get yourself into that habit. Yeah. All right. So, the piece of music that I was playing at the beginning of the class, right? This was an adhan, or a call to worship, performed by an Australian muezzin by the name of Idris Islami. Now, usually you will hear this in cities, right? You know, the muezzin will go up into the towers that flank the mosque, 5 times a day at the required times for prayer, and will perform the adhan, and then that's to let people know it's time to to take out your mat and roll it out and pray. This guy is actually, you could probably hear wind in the background here. Islami was actually performing this on top of a mountain in an Australian national park. So the sound is probably carrying a much greater distance than would be normal for the call to prayer. Now, before we get started talking about the text for today and the historical contexts, do you guys have any particular questions or observations about what you read, or about anything relevant to what we're doing?
What exactly is a muezzin?
Okay, a muezzin is essentially, he is a kind of prayer singer. And his job, his function is to perform this call to prayer. Not all mosques actually have their own muezzin, particularly in areas that are rather poor, or where getting up into a tower where people can see you is very, very dangerous. They might instead play a recording. But yeah, a muezzin is he's trained in particular musical techniques. You could probably hear that he was kind of singing through his nose, right? And that's normal. That's sort of how the adhan is performed. In fact, singing and chanting are very, very important parts of Islamic religious services. The Qur'an is actually written to be sung or to be chanted. You see a similar thing in Jewish recitations of the Torah, right? If you see the rabbi stand up in front of the congregation, he chants the Torah portion for that particular day in a sing-song sort of fashion, which he's learned from previous rabbis and so on and so forth, passed down through generations. Muslim imams do the same thing, right? The portions of the Quran that they read, they will sing during the prayer service, right? And it helps to serve as a kind of mnemonic device, and it also demonstrates that the text actually has, in Arabic, a peculiar rhythm to it, right? It's not just prose. It might help if we think about sort of what, to a believing Muslim, this text is as well, right? So what you read today, if you are a believing Muslim, is not the Quran. What you read is merely an aid to understanding the Quran for someone who does not read Arabic. The true Quran for a Muslim believer is in Arabic. It can't really be translated and still be a Quran. This is because they believe it to be a recitation. In fact, Quran means recitation in Arabic. To the Prophet Muhammad of God's own divine book. So the Quran in Arabic is itself an earthly imitation of the heavenly book. And then any translation into other languages is a pale imitation of the true Quran. It's a sort of second order imitation. Does this sound familiar at all? Does this sound at all like anything we talked about last time? Yeah, and there are reasons for this, right? So this sounds a little bit like Plato, yeah? And some of you may or may not know, right, that in the Arab world, Greek philosophy was still being practiced, was still being studied at a time when it was forgotten in the West and in Europe, right? So during the so-called Dark Ages in Europe, in Muslim cities and Muslim countries, they were still reading all the old Greek and Roman philosophy. Now, where was I going with this, right? It probably helped to set the historical situation a little bit. So, we're talking here about, if we want to talk about the sort of material historical conditions under which the Quran came to be. We're talking about the Middle East in the 6th and 7th centuries. So, let's see. Here's my crappy map. All right, so this is the Middle East. That's Turkey-ish. Off here is Persia. There's Europe. Okay, so I know that any resemblance between this and the actual Arabian Peninsula is purely coincidental, but just go with me for a minute, okay? Right, so Arabia was caught right between two huge empires. Right, to the west, you had the Byzantine Empire, which was the successor empire to the Romans. Right, this is originated as the Eastern Roman Empire. So the Byzantine Empire was Greek-speaking. And religiously, predominantly Christian. To the east, you have the Sasanian Empire of Persia. The Sasanian Empire was primarily Zoroastrian at the time. That was the official religion of the Persian emperors. Do any of you know what Zoroastrianism is? Have any of you ever heard of this before?
Yes, but
Like the yes, but.
I can't tell you much beyond that. I think it kind of has some isn't it monotheistic? Some similarities to Christianity.
Yeah, it's much older than Christianity and may actually have influenced certain Christian and Jewish ideas. But yeah, Zoroastrianism, it's a dualistic religion. Right? The idea is that the forces of good and evil in the world are sort of evenly balanced and constantly at war with each other. Good is represented by a god called Ormazd, who represents the forces of Asha, or truth, right? What's really there, what really exists. His enemy is a sort of devil figure called Ahriman or Angramanyu, and Ahriman represents the forces of Druj, or falsehood. Right, so this is the primary belief system of ancient Persia. Right, very, very ancient religion. I don't know, how many of you are familiar with the band Queen? Okay, you are. Freddie Mercury's real name was Farouk Balsari. Yeah, he was of Persian descent, and his family was Zoroastrian, yes. So, you see here, the Arabian Peninsula is caught right between these two, and the Byzantines and the Sasanians didn't really get along so well with each other. They were frequently at war, and they were constantly vying for influence in this kind of in-between land, right? Because Arabia, despite being mostly desert, also did include a lot of very fertile coastland and was an important trading route, right? Essentially, if you wanted to get from Europe to Asia, or if you wanted to get from Asia to Europe, you had to go through Arabia. And so many cities on the peninsula became very wealthy, very cosmopolitan, right? One of these being Mecca, which, let's say it's about here-ish. Sure, why not? Now, Mecca was really a kind of melting pot city. You had native Arabians, you had Greeks, you had Persians, you had Romans, Africans, you had all sorts of people coming together to mix and trade in this city. And it was a religious mix as well. Right? Within the city, indeed within the broader Arabian Peninsula, you had Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and many of the most powerful families in Mecca belonged to what we call animist cults. Now, what animism means is you believe that certain natural objects exude divine power, right? So these animist cults in Mecca ran what were called harams. Haram. And these harams were sanctuaries where fighting was forbidden. Right? You had to leave your weapons at the door, and you had to you had to follow the rules of the cult while you were in the haram. The most famous of these, and really one of the wealthiest, was called the Kaaba. You have actually seen the Kaaba, I'm sure, on the news or in a social studies textbook or somewhere. Have any of you ever seen images of the yearly Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj? Okay, you see, like, there are a bunch of people milling around this kind of square object in a great big public square. That thing they're milling around, that's the Kaaba, right? It's still there. So the Kaaba was originally a very important haram, right, which housed a black stone that was regarded as holding a great deal of divine power. The family that maintained this haram and grew very, very wealthy from the visits of pilgrims to it were called the Quraysh. How do I spell that? Quraysh. Now, around the year 570, into the Quraysh clan was born one Muhammad ibn Abdallah. So Muhammad, son of Abdallah. And for the first 40 years of his life, Muhammad was a perfectly ordinary merchant. Successful merchant, but not otherwise particularly noteworthy. Around the year 610, he started receiving religious visions, religious revelations, right? The angel Jibreel Jibreel, by the way, is just the Arabic form of Gabriel, right? The Hebrew Gabriel. outlining to him the tenets of what was essentially going to be a new religion, right? So he starts receiving these visions around 610 and starts publicly preaching about 3 years later, after overcoming his fear of the disapproval of other members of his clan, right? And indeed, like, the disapproval of other members of the clan was a big thing here, because these guys made a lot of money, right? Their wealth and their power and their influence came from the fact that they ran this important haram, right? And if you go around changing people's religions and telling them that the black stone in the Kaaba is not a god, right? This hurts the bottom line quite a bit, right? The same reason why, like, we see Islam, when it first appears, taking off much more quickly among the lower classes and the disenfranchised than among the upper classes and the powerful, right? New religions, when they first appear, tend to be most popular amongst those who don't really have a stake in the existing order of things, right? People who do have a stake in the existing order of things like to preserve the status quo because it's working for them. So, Muhammad and his followers are eventually exiled to a city called Medina, where they've actually been invited by the population. Mecca doesn't want them. Mecca alternately laughs at and spits at them. So they go to Medina. Muhammad continues receiving revelations and eventually returns to Mecca and retakes the Kaaba from his relatives and reconsecrates it as a shrine to his new religion, right, which he calls, Islam, which in Arabic means submission. The word Muslim means one who submits. Now, most of Muhammad's converts come from these other monotheistic religions that are already present in and around the peninsula, right? So most of his early converts are Christians or Jews or Zoroastrians. So he places himself, or is placed by his followers, in a kind of lineage of prophets that takes into account the earlier religious traditions that Islam begins to displace in the region. So for Muslims, the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospels are all holy books. And the Quran comes at the end of this lineage. The basic idea here is that each of these is a correction of the previous text, right? God reveals the Torah to Moses. Moses reveals it to the people. Then the people go and muck it up. So the Psalms are revealed to David. David reveals the Psalms to the people. Once again, they get garbled or mucked up in transition, or transmission. And so another revelation is required. So the Gospels are given to Jesus and revealed to the people. But once again, certain ideas get confused and mixed up. So the Quran is supposed to be the corrective text, right? It's supposed to be there. It's there to fix the mistakes of the earlier text, right? That's the basic idea. And so this is why the so-called peoples of the book, right? Muslims, Jews, Zoroastrians, are to be respected and to given certain limited number of rights within Muslim-held territory, even though there are limits on how much believing Muslims are supposed to mix with them, right? So we'll talk about that in a minute, right? But they recognize a shared heritage, particularly with Jews and Christians, right? And Muhammad comes at the end of a line of what are called Nabi or prophets. So this would include, right, Moses, Elijah, David, Solomon. Some lineages actually include Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well. Right? Jesus is regarded as a prophet. And Muhammad is regarded as the last prophet. Right? This is it. Better get it right this time. This is the last one you people are going to get. Now, the word that's usually used to refer to Muhammad in the Quran itself is not Nabi, prophet. The word that is used to refer to Muhammad is Rasul. And Rasul means messenger. But it also carries connotations of political leader, statesman, diplomat, as well as prophet. Okay, anybody have any questions so far? Everybody still with me? Everybody following?
So Muhammad came through the same lineage as Moses, Elijah, and David?
Not the same biological lineage, but the sort of the line of prophets, yeah. Yeah, so he's not regarded as a biological relative of the Jewish prophets or of Jesus. But he is regarded as being in that same tradition. Right, so we could argue that Islam is operating in that same kind of tradition that Augustine's version of Christianity did, that Confucianism did as well, right, where we are sort of back in the realm of invented tradition, right, where you're coming up with something new, but you're attaching it to existing traditions, right? It's a new system, but you're presenting it as simply a new take on an old system, right? Everybody with me? Good. All right, so where do we go from here then? Right, so the way the book is constructed, the way it's put together, it is not narrative. You probably noticed that, right? There's no story here. Right. Most of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, right? I say Hebrew and Greek because those are the languages they're written in. Are narrative, right? They tell a story, even if that story is sometimes woven together from a variety of different stories, right? They tell a continuous narrative. There is no narrative in the Quran. There's no story. It is divided up into units that are called surahs. And surah doesn't translate cleanly from Arabic into English, but it means something like revelation. Now the surahs are not numbered. They are referred to usually by a traditional name. And that traditional name comes from a particular image or unusual word that's used in the surah, right? So, for example, the one that I had you read was the feast, right? There's nothing specifically about feasting that, the surah isn't specifically about feasting, right? There are references to food and to dietary law and to, a feast, right? But it's not the thrust of the whole surah. It's just that particular image occurs in the surah, so that gives it its name, right? Now, the other thing about these surahs is the way they are arranged. They are not arranged in the order of composition. And they are not arranged according to any real theological or ideological or narrative pattern. They're arranged according to length. With the exception of the opening, which is the shortest, the longest surahs are at the beginning, and the shortest surahs are at the end. So, the arrangement has nothing to do with their date of composition, and probably it has nothing to do with, it has actually, we know has nothing to do with the dates at which Muhammad was supposed to have received these particular revelations, right? The Quran as we know it takes its form around, I wrote this down so I didn't have to remember it. Okay, so in its current form, it comes together around the years, somewhere between 650 and 656. Under the reign of the third caliph, whose name was Uthman. And it's assembled out of pre-existing material. Essentially what Uthman and his followers did was take, the pre-existing chapters, the pre-existing surahs, and put them into a definitive order, right? There are older Quranic materials than this that are not in the same order. In fact, the oldest one that has been found, it's called the Birmingham Quran now because it's housed in Birmingham in England. It's been carbon dated, the parchment and ink have been carbon dated to sometime between the years 568 and 645. So given when we know Muhammad lived, right, that his ministry didn't start till the year 613, it's probably in the later end of that date range. And it presents 3 of the surahs sort of in the middle of the current Quran. But yeah, that's the oldest known Quran manuscript we have. So yay, good times, right? Fun. Just pointing that out. All right, all right. So, any questions about any of this before I move on to sort of doctrine and belief issues?
When they came back to Mecca, how did he take the Kaaba that belonged to him?
Partly by persuasion, partly by force. One thing that he did was make alliance with a number of the desert tribes who were pastoral nomads, or raising mostly goats and camels, and had very strong martial traditions. So yeah, he combined his own followers, taken largely from the merchant classes, with these new followers that he found out in the desert oases, who had these warrior codes, warrior traditions, and it ended up working out pretty well for them. Any other questions about any of this before we go into matters of belief and doctrine? Okay, then let's talk about what doctrines the Quran assumes to be true. Right, so the first things to note here are about the nature of God and how it differs from other related religious traditions. Right? First, there is no attempt in the Quran to justify the existence of God. The existence of God is simply assumed. Right? In fact, the way the whole text is structured, right, is this is God speaking through Jibreel to Muhammad. Right? God, or Allah, is both all good and all powerful. His actions are always for the best, even if you can't see that. Right? God is the creator of everything in existence. And so far we don't necessarily see a huge difference between this and Christian and Jewish belief, right? Except that the all good portion is a little bit murkier in Jewish belief. The big difference here is in the nature of creation, right? So if we read the book of Genesis, right, both of the creation stories in the book of Genesis, right? So for Christians and Jews, right, the creation of the world is something that's in the past, right? This was a thing that happened, right? God spent 6 days making the world and then rested, right? Then stopped. The world is made. It exists now. Hooray. In Islam, the process of creation is ongoing. Right? It didn't stop when on the seventh day he rested, right? To a Muslim believer, God is still creating the world. Right? So creation is still active. Something that's still happening. The other big difference between Christianity and Judaism and Islam has to do with human relationship to God. Right? So, for Christians and Jews, right, essentially you have a certain amount of free will, right? It is your personal responsibility or your responsibility as a people to maintain your covenant with God. Right? It's up to you to follow the rules. It's up to you to maintain that tie to the divine. And if you screw it up, if you fail to do that, then the consequences fall on you. In Islam, like, remember that what Islam means in Arabic is submission. Human will is completely subordinate to God's will in Islam. Nothing can happen unless God allows it to happen. You can't do anything that God won't let you do. Right? God is all-powerful. God's will shapes everything. If you commit some sort of grave sin or some, horrible act, then God had some reason for allowing that to happen, right? And because we're mere human beings, we're not capable of understanding what that is. Right, so when we say all-powerful here, right, we mean all-powerful. And much more active in the world, generally, than the Judeo-Christian God concept is usually perceived as being, right? Okay, the other thing to note here about the nature of God, right? Now, note that Muslims regard Jesus as an important prophet, but as you probably noticed from the reading here, right? What does it explicitly say Jesus is not?
The Son of God.
Yeah. It says explicitly in the reading that Jesus is not the Son of God. Let me see if I can find that passage. Okay, on the one hand, we have on page 79 here. We took a pledge from the children of Israel and sent messengers to them. Whenever a messenger brought them anything they did not like, they accused some of lying and put others to death. They thought no harm could come to them, and so became blind and deaf to God. God turned to them in mercy, but many of them again became blind and deaf. God is fully aware of their actions. Right? So we're talking about the way the Jews treated the prophets that were sent to them. Those who say, God is the Messiah, son of Mary, have defied God. The Messiah himself said, children of Israel, worship God, my Lord and your Lord. If anyone associates others with God, God will forbid him from the garden, and hell will be his home. No one will help such evildoers. Those people who say that God is the third of three are defying the truth. There is only one God. If they persist in what they are saying, a painful punishment will afflict those of them who persist. Why do they not turn to God and ask his forgiveness when God is most forgiving, most merciful? The Messiah, son of Mary, was only a messenger. Other messengers had come and gone before him. His mother was a virtuous woman. Both ate food like other mortals. So, the point he's trying to make here, he's making a point about the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, right? That God is a three-part entity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. He's saying, no, God, is a unitary single being. And that anything mortal, right, anything that walks and talks and eats food cannot be God. God is beyond those things. To say that God would take a mortal form to a Muslim is blasphemy, right? It's something akin to idolatry. Right? God can't be, it's probably not quite accurate to say God can't be human, because God is all-powerful, can do anything, but God won't be human. And they would argue that you should not worship God in a human form or understand him as a human being. All right, along similar lines here, let's see. Page 82. When the disciples said, Jesus, son of Mary, can your Lord send down a feast to us from heaven, right? Hence the name of the surah, the name of the chapter. He said, beware of God if you are true believers. They said, we wish to eat from it, to have our hearts reassured, to know that you have told us the truth, and to be witnesses of it. Jesus, son of Mary, said, Lord, send down to us a feast from heaven so that we can have a festival, the first and last of us, and a sign from you. Provide for us, you are the best provider. God said, I will send it down to you, but anyone who disbelieves after this will be punished with a punishment that I will not inflict on anyone else in the world. When God says, Jesus, son of Mary, did you say to people, take me and my mother as two gods alongside God? He will say, may you be exalted. I would never say what I had no right to say. If I had said such a thing, you would have known it. You know all that is within me, though I do not know what is within you. You alone have full knowledge of things unseen. I told them only what you commanded me to. Worship God, my Lord, and your Lord. So, the idea here, the words that the text puts into Jesus' mouth are that Jesus himself does not claim to be a God or to be God. That this is something that his followers have done, right? That this is part of this process of misinterpretation that has led to the necessity of the Quran emerging, right? Now, one other thing that I would really like to sort of hit upon here, probably two other things. Let's think about the nature of the city where Muhammad grew up and where he began his career as a preacher, right? Now, what have we said about Mecca as a city? What was its lifeblood? How did it get rich?
Like a trading port.
Yeah, trade, right? I don't think it's not a port. I think Mecca is inland. I don't think it's a port. But it was an important trade center, right? It was a place you had to pass through to get between Europe and Asia, right? So it grew extremely rich through trade. Now, what this means is that many of the earliest adherents of the religion came from the lower reaches of the merchant classes. These were the first people to whom Muhammad preached. And we often see certain principles couched in business language. Within the Quran. So to take a couple of examples here, starting from the beginning of the feast. On page 75. God took a pledge from the children of Israel. We made 12 leaders arise among them, and God said, I am with you. If you keep up the prayer, pay the prescribed alms, believe in my messengers and support them, and lend God a good loan, I will wipe out your sins and admit you into the gardens graced with flowing streams. Right? So if you behave fairly, honestly, and justly in our little metaphorical business transaction, right? This is how you gain access to paradise, right? You give God a loan of your soul, and you pay it off by doing good deeds, by behaving righteously, right? And then when you die, and you are rejoined with your soul, you pass on into paradise, right? You've done enough good deeds to redeem your soul back from God who was holding it in pledge, right? It's like divine layaway.
What I don't understand is so you pay off your soul by doing good deeds, but if bad deeds can just be attributed to God's will and there's no consequence.
It's not that there are no consequences, and it's not so much that God made you do it as that God allowed you to do it for purposes unknown, right? Because we can't actually see the plan. So God doesn't necessarily make you do anything, but you are able to sin because for whatever reason he permits it. Now, that's still, the consequences of that are still on you, right? The consequences of that are still on you. But God has the power to stop you if he chooses to do so, right? The idea is that he chooses, you can do it because he chooses not to stop you for whatever reason. But we can't know that reason. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we see also, right, on page 77, right, you who believe, be mindful of God. Seek ways to come closer to him and strive for his cause so that you may prosper. If the disbelievers possessed all that is in the earth and twice as much again, and offered it to ransom themselves from torment on the day of resurrection, it would not be accepted from them. They will have a painful torment. They will wish to come out of the fire, but they will be unable to do so. Theirs will be a lasting torment, right? This is the same concept, right? But this is what happens to the bad soul that tries to redeem itself with earthly wealth, right? It's like, okay, yeah, you possessed everything, you possessed all the good things of the earth, but you didn't believe and you didn't do right. So you're still going to hell, right? Do not pass go, do not collect $200, go straight to hell. You are not buying your soul back. And I think it might also help if we talked a little bit about what one needs to do in order to do right. Right, so there are basically 5 practices that are sometimes referred to as the pillars, the 5 pillars. Right, and these are expected it's 5, not fire pillars. Very different concept. These are behaviors that are expected of every Muslim, right? The first is salat, or prayer. Right. 5 times a day, at the prescribed hours, you are supposed to, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, kneel down, face Mecca, and pray. Right? You are supposed to give to God just these 5 moments out of your day. The second is zakat, or almsgiving. You are expected to pay a certain not unreasonable portion of your income for the upkeep and maintenance of the poor. Right? The idea being that if God has blessed you with prosperity, then you need to give some of that back to the community to help raise up your less fortunate brothers and sisters. The third is the Ramadan fast, right? During the holy month of Ramadan, you are expected from sunup to sundown to let nothing but water pass your lips, right? You can drink water so you don't dehydrate. And you're not expected to actually fast for a whole month, right? It's just from sunup to sundown. You can eat before sunrise, you can eat after sunset. But you're supposed to eat only sort of like small, modest meals at that time. You are also expected, if you are able to, at some point in your life, to make the Hajj or the pilgrimage to Mecca. Right. If you are unable to do so because of the cost or because of, illness, infirmity, right? This is one of those things where it's, well, God understands, right? But if you are able to do this, you are expected to do this. And finally, there's the Shahada, or confession of faith. Right. In order to convert to Islam, in order to become a Muslim, one is expected to recite the confession of faith. You'll see when we look at various Middle Eastern texts through the rest of the course, there will be points at which characters will start this little speech that starts with, there is no God but Allah, and Allah is great, and so on and so forth, right? What they're doing there is they're reciting the confession of faith at either times of joy, as a sort of thank you, or times of sorrow as something to strengthen them, right? So you will definitely be seeing You'll be seeing all 5 of these, or references to all 5 of these, when we look at the 1001 Nights after break. So I just wanted you to be aware of them before. I think our presentation group will sort of be discussing a little bit more about how these relate directly to things in the Nights, right? That's the task. Okay, right. One more thing I want to focus on sort of in the actual text that we read. And then I will set you free for the time being. Can we look on page 74? Can I get a volunteer to read starting from You Who Believe?
You who believe,
Thank you,
fulfill
sir.
your obligations. Livestock animals are lawful as food for you, with the exception of what is about to be announced to you. You are forbidden to kill game while you are on pilgrimage. God commands what he will, so you who believe do not violate the sanctity of God's rites, the sacred month, the offerings, the garlands, nor those going to the sacred house to seek the bounty and pleasure of their Lord. But when you have completed the rites of pilgrimage, you may hunt. Do not let your hatred for the people who barred you from the sacred mosque induce you to break the law. Help one another to do so what is right and good. Do not help one another towards sin and hostility. Be mindful of God, for his punishment is severe.
Okay, thank you. So the idea here, right, it starts by talking about dietary laws, right, eat whatever is lawful for you to eat, but here are the caveats, right? We're going to let you know here now what is lawful for you to eat, right? Don't go hunting when you're on pilgrimage, right? Don't go hunting when you're engaged in some sort of sacred activity. Now, the injunction here seems to be against, generally speaking, killing anything while you are in pursuit of some sacred duty, right? If you kill a person or an animal, right? A person I would hope not to eat, right? Then you have rendered yourself impure, right? And you can't continue on the pilgrimage, right? You can't go before the Lord, you can't go into the sacred house with blood on your hands. And this harkens back to those old laws of the haram, right? What were you not allowed to do in the haram? What were you not allowed to do in the sanctuaries of those animist cults that ruled Mecca before Islam?
Fight.
Yeah, no fighting, right? That was rule number 1. Right? No weapons, no fighting. So that rule here is preserved, right? As you make your pilgrimage to what the thing that the haram has now been repurposed as, you are not supposed to fight, you are not supposed to kill, even an animal. All right, so can I get somebody then to continue from you are forbidden to eat carrion? Thank you, Sarah.
You are forbidden to eat carrion, blood, pig's meat, any animal over which any name other than God's has been invoked, any animal strangled or victim of a violent blow or a fall, or gored or savaged by a beast of prey, unless you still slaughter it in the correct manner, or anything sacrificed on idolatrous altars. You are also forbidden to allot shares of meat by drawing marked arrows, a heinous practice. Today the disbelievers have lost all hope that you would give up your religion. Do not fear them, fear me. Today I have perfected your religion for you, completed my blessing upon you, and chosen as your religion Islam, total devotion to God. But if any of you is forced by hunger to eat forbidden food with no intention of doing wrong, then God is most forgiving and merciful.
All right, thank you. So one thing to remember here, right, that this is not meant to be taken as Muhammad speaking, right? He's not the speaker. He's not telling the people, I have perfected your religion for you, right? This is the Archangel Jibreel speaking the words of God to Muhammad, right? Muhammad is the recipient of the message. He's not the speaker. Other things to note here, right? When we talk about what you are forbidden to eat, right? So don't eat carrot, like basically don't eat roadkill, right? Don't eat things that you just find lying around already dead. Now this is largely a kind of practical injunction, right? Like if it's been lying around dead for a while, it's probably not good to eat anymore. You'll probably get sick. Don't touch that. Don't eat blood or pig's meat. Does this look familiar at all to anybody? Are there other related religions where people are forbidden from eating blood or pig's meat?
Judaism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Seventh-day Adventists also forbid it.
Pardon?
Seventh-day Adventists also forbid it.
Yes.
I mean, that's a minor side note, but
Right.
it's another religion.
Yeah. But yeah, like the rules are very similar to kosher law. Right? Don't eat pig's meat. Don't eat blood. Don't eat any animal over which any name other than God's has been invoked, right? So essentially, do not eat the meat of animals that have been sacrificed to pagan idols. Right? If this animal has been dedicated to some being other than Allah, some being other than God, right? It's been a participant in blasphemous rites, and its flesh is forbidden to you. Now, the other thing here that might see, don't eat an animal that has been victim of violent blow or fall or gored or savaged by a beast of prey unless you still slaughter it in the correct manner. A lot of these sorts of things, that we see similar things in kosher law as well, that a lot of these are actually injunctions against cruelty to animals, right? Don't strangle it, don't gore it, don't hurt animals unnecessarily. But the other thing here, the thing that maybe struck you as weird is the whole thing about the arrows. Right, using arrows to draw lots. So allotting shares of meat to people by having them draw arrows, right? Everybody draws some arrows out of the quiver, and depending on which arrow you drew, that's how much meat you got, right? Essentially, what are you using then to decide who gets what share? Chance, exactly. You're leaving it up to chance. Now, why might Muhammad have a problem, or Muhammad's concept of God have a problem with you leaving things up to chance? Is there any such thing as chance, according to Muslim belief? Everything that happens is the will of God, right? Everything happens because God allows it to happen. So anything you do that demonstrates a belief in chance is sinful. Right? Anything you do that demonstrates that you believe some force in the universe other than God allots the shares to people is blasphemous. Okay, so I know that this is, that we are getting on close to the break. We've got about maybe 10 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? Any questions about anything at all regarding the text, regarding anything that I have said? And look, I do want to say, I'm not myself a religious person of any stripe, right? I'm a person with a PhD who reads a lot of books. And so most of what I know of, I know this sort of thing not through practice, but through reading. And, my intent is never to denigrate any particular religion. My intent is never to try to exalt any particular religion over another, right? What I'm trying to do is give you mostly sort of context for the historical development of a particular text, right? These particular social and historical factors led to this text coming together in this particular way at this particular time, right? Okay. Any questions about anything?
In Islam, how does the concept of hell, or is there a Satan figure in comparison?
There is a rebellious spirit called Iblis or Shaitan. And I forget exactly where Iblis comes from. I don't think it's quite the same as the story of sort of Lucifer's rejection of God. I think where it comes from is Iblis is the leader of a group of spirits called the Jinn, right? D-J-I-N-N. So how many of you know what a genie is, or have ever heard the word genie? Okay, right. So you've all seen Aladdin, right? So that's actually what Iblis is a jinn. This is sometimes translated into English as demon, but it's not a demon the way we would think of it, right? So keep that in mind when you are reading 1001 Nights. So jinn are very powerful spirits from Arabian folklore, from pre-Islamic Arabian folklore, that sort of get worked into the Islamic belief system. They can fly, they can grant wishes, they can curse or bless people, right? They can do all sorts of things. And some of the jinn are good and follow God and help humanity. Some of the jinn, like Iblis and those who follow him, reject God's authority and make their own way, right? And they reject his authority, again, because he allows it. He allows them to make trouble. So that would probably be the closest to like a Satan figure. I think the way the story goes is that God commanded Iblis to bow to Adam and Eve, and he refused, because he regarded them as creatures inferior to himself. Any other questions? Anything else we're curious about or unclear about? Anything at all? All right, then for next time, we're going to be looking at a portion of an important medieval Catholic poem. Right, you're going to be reading parts of Dante's Inferno. I'm not asking you to read the whole thing. Right, what you're going to be reading is about a third of it. Right, I have the page numbers for each of the cantos I want you to read marked on the syllabus. It'll add up to probably about 40 pages total, right? So, which is a lot less than the full length of the Inferno. So I have the questions here I want you to ponder as you read. Remember as well that if you do those revisions of the paper over the break, you can improve your grade. Once you've got whatever you want or need here, you are free to go. We'll see you in a week and a half.